Hebrews chapter 7, we're just finishing up this section of 11 through 19. And I think for right now, I'm just going to read 18 and 19, and then we'll come back and look at the next section here in this. So Hebrews 7 for tonight, let's just start with verses 18 and 19. For on the one hand, there's a setting aside of a former commandment because of its weakness and uselessness. For the law made nothing perfect. And on the other hand, there's a bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God. This is kind of where we left off. The bringing in of that better hope. And just thinking about what that means. It's an interesting term for the new covenant. I know Mr. Sutton pointed out it's something my brain hadn't really read it that way in contrast to the setting aside. God is interested in I was Bible studying with the guy today, and it is quite a revelation sometimes for people to realize God's plan isn't just setting aside the old. It's important. You got to do it. But if there's nothing that comes in its place, what good did that do? It's always interesting to me. You go into places where they're, Flying J. You guys notice that place? Some of you guys, man, really liked that place. I know. Lynn, I'm not particularly picky, but some of my brethren, like Davis Ashley and Caden, and who raved about it, I've been like, I don't know I had quite the same experience you guys are feeling about that. But what do you notice about that place? It's shut down. What? It had good breakfast. True, it doesn't anymore. But I don't know exactly what all they got to do to that place, but quite the overhaul it looks like. And does anybody know what's coming in there? Town. Of course. Of course.
Flying J in Belgrade.
Not.
I heard that.
Flying J in Belgrade.
There is a for lease sign on front. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so it's interesting. Who knows for sure? Okay? But it does no good to tear that place down unless you have a purpose for it, of where it's going to go. And so God does have a purpose that He is taking us, and there is truly a setting aside of a former commandment. Anybody thankful that you're not under the Leviticus rules? I mean, I can't even figure out all the rules on the leprosy in the house and the... Whew. Man, I don't know what we'd have to be checking for on the floor of this place, ripping up that carpet. I'm thankful to not be under... I'm thankful to setting aside of that former commandment. But even more thankful of God bringing in this better hope, right? And so, interesting term for that new covenant. The Old Testament, really, there wasn't a hope other than looking forward to the new. But this hope of the new covenant, he's referred to it a bunch in the book of Hebrews, actually. And in Hebrews 6, he talks about a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil, where Jesus has entered for us. So I just think about, even in this context here, bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God. Let's, just a second here. Was there a means of being able to pray to God under the Old Covenant? David prayed. He was heard. There was a means of that. But is there a little shift under the New Covenant, even in reference to our prayers? It's a pretty big shift, isn't there? And I think it is important for us as Christians that we do wrap our mind around this. Sometimes I've heard Christians say, well, I've had my kids praying about this particular thing. It's super important, and I know that God hears my kids. Well, that's true. Okay, Matthew 18 does say that, but who has better access? Children or Christians? Children have angels who are beholding the Father on their behalf. we have a great high priest. We have access to the throne of grace. We can draw near. And so this is a tremendous hope. I mean, I do think sometimes there's a, matter of fact, Ken, see you tonight. You and I have had some discussions before where I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I've got the impression that sometimes you think there's a little bit of a frivolous or casual attitude sometimes in Christians in terms of their access to God. I don't know if you remember what I'm talking about, but sometimes where people just kind of almost barge into God's presence without really thinking the only way we have access to God is through Jesus Christ. Do you remember any of these conversations? Okay. So I'm not making stuff up. As a Christian, it is important. I mean, when we say, in the name of Jesus Christ, that has real meaning. It's the means by which, He is the means by which we can draw near to God. So I do think there's a side of this where the world has an idea that anytime you want to, you come barging into God's room, say, okay, God, I'm ready. That's not the picture. You know, Esther has a number of great lessons within it, but one of the lessons within Esther is that nobody comes into the king's presence unannounced. Now, God, through Jesus, has extended that scepter, and so we're thankful for that. This is a tremendous hope, guys, that we can be in the Holy of Holies, much better than the back room of that physical temple, in the very presence of God. We can draw near. What God has done for us. I guess a question, and maybe I left us with last week that I would like us each to consider is, with this tremendous privilege, do we take that opportunity as much as we could or should? It's a tremendous hope. When things are going rough, do you have access? Thankful, God, for the access. When things are going great, do you have access to say thank you? When we are bowed down before His throne and saying, not my will, but yours be done, do we have access to, God, what do you want from me today? We can draw near. What a tremendous hope, opportunity we have under this new covenant. One which enters within the veil. We truly are blessed to be able to draw near to God right now. Any questions or comments on that before we launch into the last section here of chapter 7? Is it worth a little refresher from the scriptures of what a privilege we do have? And I think every Old Testament faithful person longed for what we have. They wanted the opportunities that God's given it to us. So let's not be casual about it or frivolous, but let's take the opportunities that God has given to us with humility, but also with confidence because of what Jesus has done for us. All right. Let's launch into this last section here of Hebrews 7, verse 20 through 28. And inasmuch as it was not without an oath, for they, talking about the Levitical priests, they indeed became priests without an oath, but he with an oath. To the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever. So much the more also Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. And the former priests, on the one hand, existed in greater numbers because they were prevented by death from continuing. But he, on the other hand, because he abides forever, holds his priesthood permanently. Hence also he is able to save forever those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners and exalted above the heavens, who does not need daily, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people, because this he did once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men as high priests who are weak, but the word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints a son made perfect forever. Some key points we're going to be hitting in this section. Jesus is high priest by oath. He's the guarantee of a better covenant. He is eternal, so his priesthood can't be transferred. He's able to save forever. Really thankful for that one. We have such a high priest, which he goes on to describe. And then this high priest is the Son made perfect forever. So, that's not the right order. There we go. Previously, in this chapter, we've seen that Jesus is high priest by the power of an indestructible life. And we did talk about the importance of that. I think Keaton, in his opening on Lord's Day, was saying sometimes there's unanswerable questions, or at least questions we don't yet know the answer to, and wanting to know it all. And, the reality of it is, God has given us everything that we need to know. But some of you guys know an analogy that I like, the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where he takes the blind leap. And I always like, throw the dart first before you, please, just throw something out. And God does want us to throw some dirt. He wants us to make sure there's something there. But we know there's something there, but does God ever say we can see all the way across that thing? No. He gives us enough that we know, though, that he can see all the way across that thing. And so we can have trust in him. So the fact of Jesus' indestructible life, when he speaks on something, he has authority to speak on anything and everything. When he says he was there at the creation, and this is the way it happened, Genesis chapter 6, okay. He is faithful and true witness. Nobody else I'd rather listen to. He proved it by his resurrection from the dead. And he is that high priest by the power of that indestructible life. This also, though, is in accordance with an oath that God made. If Jesus rose from the dead in a vacuum of history, all of a sudden some guy rises from the dead and says, hey, listen to me, I would be compelled to listen to him. But Jesus didn't rise from the dead all of a sudden out of nowhere, did he? It's all prophesied. When he's making these claims to be high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, it was in accordance with an oath. How were the priests under that Old Testament? How were they chosen? What'd you say? Yeah, biologically, through their physical lineage, right? Did Aaron take the honor to himself? No. We know some guys that tried to. It didn't work out very well for him. Aaron didn't take the honor to himself, but received it when he was called by God. And every priest thereafter in the Old Testament, you had to be born the right tribe, the right family. Otherwise, you couldn't be a priest. They were priests without an oath. It was under the Old Covenant, but it was never, in other words, it was temporal by God's intent. It was a shadow. The physical representation. So, I want to think about this for a second. All of my math students are downstairs, so you guys are going to have to be my math students tonight. Okay? How do we find the volume of any object? What's the simple, most basic way to explain? How do we find the volume of an object? Let's make it really easy. Let's make it a cube. How do we find the volume of a cube? Okay, area of the base. Okay, we start with the area of the base, and then we push it through the height. Now, I don't know why this is. Well, I do, because math can be abstract. But sometimes some of my students, when they are first coming to that, where they don't get it. So I say, okay, you know those glass elevators that you can see through? Let's pretend like you're standing on the floor of that, okay? And we got to fill up all of this space, right? So you're on the floor of this, and that's the volume. This inside space, and you got to take the bottom of that thing and then up through. There are some physical illustrations that help us. Okay, let's make this slightly more complicated, and this is as far as we're going to go tonight. Same concept. Well, actually, no, I don't want to do the same concept. How do we find the surface area of a cylinder? Does everybody know what I mean when I say cylinder? I see Lily over there saying, come on, I was out of school a while ago. Don't bring this stuff back up. Okay, wow, there's pi, okay? 3.14 has something to do with pi. So let's just make, for my point, let's just talk about lateral surface area of a cylinder. That means we're excluding the top and the bottom, right? We're just going around. So how do we do that? It does have to do with 3.14, but so you got to take the circumference and multiply it by the height. Okay? And circumference equals pi times what? Area equals pi r squared. Circumference equals pi times? We can either say 2 pi r or we can say pi d, right? Pi diameter. Okay? Why am I teaching math tonight? Okay. Who cares, right? But some kids have sometimes it's not as obvious to students as it is to Mel. You take the circumference of this thing and you push it to the height. But if you actually have one of those, a little kin, and you say, okay, if we cut this thing, okay, and we unroll it, guess what we have? A rectangle. And they already know how to find the area of a rectangle, the base times the height. Now in this case, when you unroll it and you show it, the base of this happens to be the circumference of the circle when you unroll it. Okay? So a physical illustration sometimes can be really helpful. God started with a physical illustration to bring us something much more complicated, honestly, in the spiritual realm, into the realm of the unseen. We might say, in a little closer analogy, we might sometimes do testing of prototypes. So, how many of you think about the flood of Noah's day? For it to create, first of all, cause the absolute destruction of that old world and bring about this new world that we see around us, things like the whole Grand Canyon, all those things carved, actually everything around us, basically, geologically. Together, how in the world did an ark survive in that thing? I don't know. I actually think the miracle was the salvation more than the destruction. how in the world anybody survived to that miracle of salvation. But people that are scientists and get into this kind of stuff, what are they? They're going to make small. It's really hard to test something the size of an ark in the conditions of the flood. How do you duplicate that? So what they did, let's make a smaller ark and try to create that sort of chaotic environment that we can control in a smaller setting and see how this thing does. And it is actually one of the things they found is the dimensions of the ark are really seaworthy. Okay? It's great dimensions for that. But there's a physical or a prototype test to be able to go to something bigger. In this case, God takes a physical, the whole priesthood in that Old Testament, and he intended it to be temporal. It's something that people sometimes have a hard time understanding about God. This physical body, 51 years old, is not as spry as it was when it was 31 years old. It's not supposed to be. It's temporal. Where's the real? Inside. The outer man is decaying. If the inner man is decaying, you're in trouble. The inner man's being renewed, David. The inner man's the real, right? And it's pointing us to our eternal home, our eternal body. So the spiritual is the real, it's the eternal. Let's actually flip over to 2 Corinthians 4. I think it's really easy for human beings to get this backwards. Sometimes we think the things we can touch and experience through our senses, those are the real. And I'm thankful that there is some things, some substance that are real. But guys, those are the shadow of the eternal. He says it this way in 2 Corinthians 4:18. While we look not at the things which are seen, but the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, for the things which are not seen are eternal. One of the things the book of Hebrews is trying to help us do is see the things that are unseen. To look into the realm of the eternal. And so, the high priest in the Old Testament, that lineage of Aaron, is temporal. It was a shadow. They became priests without an oath. When God speaks of Jesus' high priesthood, and he does it with an oath, this is his eternal and perfect plan. We've already been over the verses. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Approximately how many years was that statement made? You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek, before Jesus showed up in this world. About 1,000 years ahead of time. Hey, God made it with an oath. This is where I am going. This is my eternal and perfect plan. That law was designed to be temporal. From the beginning, that was God's it wasn't supposed to last forever. Wow, I really got these things messed up in order. So we see again here the connection between the priesthood and the covenant. The new priesthood has to have an accompanying covenant. Verse 22, so much the more also Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. So Jesus' exaltation as a superior high priest ensures there's a better covenant. It is shocking to me sometimes. Let's start with the most basic version that's shocking to me is Messianic Judaism. We're really thankful that Jesus came, but you got to keep the law. All those laws are still there. You got to keep them. I don't remember the number off the top of my head. What What a wonderful life. Thank you for this abundant life, Jesus, that you brought to us. Keep every single one of those laws. What a miserable existence. And we could actually boil it down to this. They have no concept of who Jesus really is. If they did, there's no way you would go back under that system. Now let's pick on the premillennials for a second. Okay. We have this really great, thank you, Jesus, sacrifice is awesome, and we can't wait for you to come back and set up an earthly kingdom and restore all those Old Testament sacrifices. What in the world? What's that tell you? No concept of who Jesus really is. Now let's make this personal. I think it's really easy sometimes to pick on the Mormons, and I do pick on them, and the Messianic Jews, and I do, and premillennials, and I do. But let's make this a little more personal. Have you ever found yourself in your zeal to whoop yourself into shape? Have you ever found yourself putting yourself under the law? I don't mean going and making a sacrifice in the backyard, but basically putting yourself back on, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, as an example. Now, I've done that, but if that's happening, what's the issue? Going back under law, because what did we say? The Messianic Jews, why are they doing that? They don't see Jesus as he is. The premillennialists, why are they don't see Jesus. If I'm doing that, I'm not seeing Jesus as he is. If we see Jesus as he is, that former commandment with its weakness and uselessness, we're not going back to it. And so God wants us to see Jesus as he is. We were a little running late tonight, so I'm going to just hand this to you, Jerry.
I don't have the quote exactly, but do you recall in the debate, the accusation made by Chuck that, or the comment made that there was a person he knew who almost went crazy from effort of trying to live up to the standards of the new creation that Jay taught. You remember that?
I do remember that.
It's a bad quote.
I do remember that. And let's say this for a second. If you are trying to achieve perfection by means of the law, is that going to have a good end? No. So blame it on Jay. Or the problem is not seeing Jesus as he is. And, that is one of the great challenges, guys, in all honesty. We see God's plan is perfection. We've seen that from this chapter. If you are thinking about this, which I've found most people, we're not seeing it right. Jesus did not intend, he's not making this tougher. He's saying, this is where God's going with you. This is what I'm going to do in you and through you. And so getting the picture of seeing Jesus as he is liberates us to be able to enjoy this journey that God is taking, that he is going to bring about within us his perfection. It's really a fun place to be. Now, I think all of us along the way, we realize sometimes how you can bash your head against the brick wall and we're okay, this isn't work. Okay, what was God's plan? What is God's plan for victory? But I just want to emphasize, first and foremost, God's plan for victory starts with us seeing Jesus as he is. I think we can all fast forward to Hebrews 12, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. I think back in Hebrews 3, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession. I think Mr. Sutton said, that he's thought of that as the theme of Hebrews. Consider Jesus is the picture. We see Jesus as he is. The other things come through. I will say, I was 29 years old at the time of the debate. And when my dad first told me his approach to the debate, I thought, it's not the way I would have done it. And I wanted to get down, What was the main focus in that debate that my dad put forth? It's really Jesus in glory. That was the focal point of that. And that's the right place. Everything else flows from that. If we don't get that right, the rest of it can't even talk about. So I'm actually very, very appreciative of his approach in that. So Jesus' exaltation then as superior high priest ensures there is a better covenant. When we see Jesus as he is, there's this better covenant that comes along with that. What is that? The way he says it here is in verse 22. So much the more also Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. His life as high priest guarantees the terms of the new covenant will be filled. Let's think about it this way. This could be translated the surety or the guarantor. If I say surety, anybody have an example? What's that mean? I didn't hear. Deposit. Okay, that concept. Okay, guarantor. Same concept. Let's even take it a little step further. Collateral. If I co-sign on somebody else's loan, Book of Proverbs warns against that, by the way. But if I do, what am I saying? I guarantee I'm good for it. If they aren't, I'm good for it. And for you to be a co-signer that the lender is willing to allow you to be a co-signer, what do they have to see? That you're good for it. That you have the assets that if something happened, they could take your assets to fulfill the terms of that. So, let's go back to Genesis. I kind of like this example. And it's actually an important concept here. Genesis 43. You guys remember the account of Joseph's brothers selling him into slavery, and then they end up having to go there. And I'm just going to jump into the middle of this. I think most of us are familiar with this account. They go back, and they aren't allowed to come back, right? Unless they bring their youngest brother with them. And so basically, why'd you do all this? And Judah, in Genesis 43, verses 8 and 9, Judah said to his father Israel, "Send the lad with me, and we will arise and go that we may live and not die." Because they're starving to death there. If they don't go back, they're all going to die. So send him with me. I should have finished that verse. Let's jump to verse 9. "I myself will be surety for him. You may hold me responsible for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame before you forever." Judah is saying, I am putting my life on the line that I'm going to bring this guy back. Now, we can follow through the rest of the story. He has to end up telling Joseph the same thing. But this is what he's saying. I will be surety. My life in place of his. And when he actually tells, I think later here, in chapter 44, verse 18 is kind of where he starts. But he wants to talk to Joseph. And then he says, verse 32, "For your servant became surety for the lad to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then let me bear the blame before my father forever. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the lad, a slave to my lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers." So he's saying, to keep me instead of him. That's surety. I'm willing to be in that place. Now, I do find it interesting. Even though as a general principle, you don't co-sign. Book of Proverbs has quite a bit to say about that. Go with me to Jeremiah. I'm really thankful that somebody even more than co-signed for me. Jeremiah chapter 30. Interesting passage here, verse 21. "And their leader shall be one of them, and their ruler shall come forth from their midst, and I will bring him near, and he shall approach me. For who would dare to risk his life to approach me, declares the Lord." Jesus, from the beginning, guys, he laid himself on the line in place of us. I'm thankful for that. But here's the problem. While you're alive, you can co-sign. And I know we talked about this before, but how can you guarantee that your will is going to be fulfilled after you're dead? You can't do it. And I've been in enough little tiny things, stuff that doesn't matter, and if people want to make a mess of it, you can make a mess of it, and make sure that that will is not really executed to the way. There can be so much tied in. Let's just say it this way. If you want to make a mess of it, you can tie it up and the attorneys get most of it instead of who was supposed to. But the fact that Jesus is a guarantee, he's a guarantor, he's surety of this covenant, the reason is because not only is he the testator, not only is he the one who made that covenant come into effect through his death, but because of his indestructible life, he is the absolute guarantor of that covenant. Brethren, this is an amazing thing. When we understand appropriately, it doesn't mean that we don't have a part to play in this, but the pressure under the new covenant, the pressure is not on us. The guarantor is Jesus. Jesus has done this. He's proven his willingness, his ability. He's guaranteed that he's going to do this.
I don't know if this is a correct analogy, but it just struck me as you were saying.
I've had some wild analogies tonight.
He's a testator. Of course, he is the executor, but he's also the judge. And that's an interesting thing because you can be the executor of a will here, and the judge can overrule that. When the lawyer he's the judge too, so there is just no way it can be broken.
I like that. That is, so he's the testator, he's the executor, but he's also the judge. That's a great point. Nobody is overriding this one. I had some pictures that popped in my mind from that, Phil, that are, it's again, some of the things that who Jesus is and what he does for us. Sometimes I get goosebumps, literally, just thinking about this. There was, Sue Schaefer one time had a play in Billings, and it was kind of, there was some of the false gods throughout history, and then God, well, Jesus himself, and they're kind of on this trial, and at some point, Jesus, who is on the trial, he turns around and he takes the seat of the judge. And when that happened in that play, I just got like, this is who Jesus is. He is the one who makes the call on everything. I don't know if I got that quite right, Braden. You were in the play probably, so you remember better than I do. Something like that. I was like, it's pretty cool. So it is amazing, guys, what Jesus has done, who he is, what he does for. He is the guarantee of this covenant. So I just want to follow up on this in one other way. What was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness? His faith. And sometimes maybe the newer English versions, mine says reckoned still. If you got any version of any updated New American Standard, in place of reckoned, what's it say? Credited. Credited is a lot easier to understand in that way. Abraham believed God, and it was credited, one ed at the end, as righteousness. Is there any risk for God? If we believe, is his work going to be fulfilled in us? He's the guarantor of the covenant. We have one responsibility, if you will, and that is belief. Who he is and the work that he is doing, he will do that work. I'm not trying to trivialize our part, our participation in this, but I do want us to understand the fulfillment of this covenant is not dependent on us, it's dependent on him. He is the guarantor. That gives me tremendous confidence because in this life, whenever there's something that I encounter, whenever there's something that I'm taking on, I do have questions. Like, I don't know for sure how this is going to turn out. Is this going to work? I mean, in this life, the battle's not always to the strong. The race isn't always to the quickest. Time and chance overtake them all. I mean, there are things in this life that we venture upon that we understand really we can absolutely do our part to hit out of the park, and there are circumstances beyond our control that can make this thing fail. Not this. Jesus is the guarantor. And so it encourages me, put it on the line. I can give my best, believing God, Jesus is the guarantee, the guarantor of this better covenant. He's eternal, so his priesthood can't be transferred. Many high priests from the lineage of Aaron, they existed in greater numbers. We talked about this a little bit last week. There's only one true high priest at a time. I do want to hit a couple things really quick before we get out of here tonight on this. So in Hebrews 7, in verse 24, I'm going to key on Jesus on the other hand, because those former priests, they were prevented by death from continuing. Okay, they kick the bucket, got to have the next guy in place. Kick the bucket, have the next guy in place. 24, Jesus on the other hand, because he abides forever, holds his priesthood permanently. Jesus lives forever. Now, I said I was going to pick on the Mormons a little bit. LDS doctrine says that John the Immerser conferred the Aaronic priesthood upon Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery on May 15th, 1829. Interesting. Sounds wild, but so does everything else within the origins of that thing. Oh, and then a little bit later, matter of fact, in 1830, so the Aaronic priesthood, John the Baptist conferred upon Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, May 15th, 1829. In August of 1830, actually a little before August of 1830, the Melchizedek priesthood was conferred by Peter, James, and John upon Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. It was conferred upon them. Now you can't. Hebrews 7 says you can't do that. Any of you guys ever or got a copy of The Kingdom of the Cults? It's actually a decent resource. The guy doesn't understand salvation, but there's a lot of little quick source stuff that can help you if you're dealing with Jehovah's Witness or Mormon or something. But I just want to read this little section to you. He says in reference to Hebrews 7:24, he says, particular attention should be paid to verse 24, which in the Greek is devastating to the Mormon claim. Verse 24 in Greek literally reads, but he continues forever, so his priesthood is untransferable. The Greek word literally rendered as untransferable carries the note of finality. So the Thayer's, Greek English lexicon, some of you have probably gone through Thayer's before. Thayer's puts it this way, the priesthood unchangeable and therefore not liable to pass to a successor. How many of you, Rotherhams, any of you guys, Joseph Rotherhams, this Bible's falling apart. They don't bind these really well. But this guy is it's not an easy read, but it is incredibly, I found it very, very consistent in its translation, very accurate translation. Listen to how he says this. It's Roman numerals, so I got to find the right spot here. But he, talking about Jesus, but he, by reason of his remaining age abidingly, untransmissible, holdeth the priesthood. Guys, this thing can't be transferred to anybody else. There is one high priest, according to the order of Melchizedek. That is Jesus Christ. It's amazing. Jesus is worthy. I'll just close tonight by thinking about us, worship in spirit and in truth. Is he worthy? Following the resurrection from the dead, when Thomas saw the holes in his hands and in his side, Thomas said, my Lord and my God. Guys, we got a lot better picture than that. How could there be any other response than in our inner man hitting the deck and saying, my Lord and my God? What Jesus has done, what he has done for us and what he continues to do for us, he abides forever. And where we're going next week in this, because he abides forever, he is able to save forever those who draw near, since he always lives to make intercession for them. The work of Jesus. I hear this. Francis Schaeffer, How Should We Then Live? One of these nights sometime down the road, we're going to show that series. But one of the things Francis Schaeffer talks about consistently is the work of Christ that was finished on the cross. What Jesus did on the cross was amazing. The work of Christ was not. He always lives to make intercession on our behalf. And, Chuck Dowdy, I think you mentioned him earlier. I think he talked about the cross being the center of gravity. The fact of the matter, brethren, is Jesus is alive. As our high priest, according to the order of Melchizedek, he guarantees this covenant. He will do his work in us who believe. Absolute guarantee. That's encouraging to me. So I want to encourage you all. Let's draw near. Let's draw near this week.